Automation Strikes in England by Cornelius Castoriadis. Originally published in July 1956 in Socialisme ou Barbarie. A year and a half ago, the precarious balance on which British capitalism has rested since the war was again threatened with being upset. Prices were rising, imports were increasing, and exports, under the growing pressure of international, and in particular German and Japanese competition, were stagnating. Thinking that the roots of this evil were to be found in excessive domestic demand that was absorbing too great a portion of production and not leaving enough for exports, Eden's conservative government tried to combat, quote, inflationary pressures, end quote, by means of tax increases and credit restrictions, especially credit on car sales. Through these measures, it also hoped to induce a certain increase in unemployment, which English capitalists consider an excellent way of disciplining workers and forcing them to, quote, moderate their wage demands, end quote. The government's measures have had till now only a slow, limited, and uncertain effect on the balance of foreign payments. On the other hand, they had succeeded in bringing about a halt in the growth of production, which has been practically stagnant now for nearly a year, and in delivering a serious blow to the automobile industry, where the workday has been shortened several times since the beginning of the year. It is in this climate that the April-May 1956 strike of Standard Motor Company workers in Coventry took place. Already in the month of March, an industrial dispute had broken out when the workers would not accept the rotating layoff of 250 workers a day, as had been decided by the company. But when on April 27th, Standard's 11,000 workers went on strike, rejecting the dismissal of 3,000 among them, the event had an infinitely greater significance. Standard, one of the, quote, Big Five, end quote, in the English automobile industry, owns 2 plants in Coventry, the Canley factory, where 6,000 workers manufacture cars, and the Banner Lane factory, where 5,000 turn out 70,000 tractors a year, about half of all English tractors produced. The dismissal of 3,000 workers was the result of a reorganization and complete retooling of the tractor factory. The introduction of, quote, automated, end quote, methods in this factory will allow the company to raise annual production to 100,000 tractors while reducing by half the number of personnel employed. This reduction in personnel was presented by the company as, quote, temporary, end quote, and accompanied by promises to rehire them once the company had completed its retooling work. The workers refused to accept this, and their stewards presented counter-proposals aimed at a reduction of work for all personnel and a reorganization of the company's production plans. These proposals were turned down by management. The ensuing strike lasted 15 days. It ended on May 11th when management partially backed down and promised to re-examine the problem in consultation with the workers' stewards. On the 25th of May, management accepted some of the workers' proposals, but on the 31st it rejected others and declared it was going to dismiss 2,600 workers. Since then, a conflict has been brewing between the men and their shop stewards, on one side who want to go on strike, and the official trade unions on the other who are trying by all kinds of maneuvers to avoid this sort of struggle. The standard workers' strike has had immense repercussions in England. It would not be an exaggeration to say that since April 26th, quote, automation, end quote, has become one of the major preoccupations of the workers, the unions, the capitalists, and the English government. What was for so long only utopia and, quote, science fiction, end quote, what yesterday was still on the drawing boards and planning charts of the industry's engineers and top accountants, has become in a few days a predominant factor in the social history of our time and the subject for front-page headlines in the major newspapers, for the problems raised by automation affect both the, quote, liberal, end quote, structure of Western capitalism and the structure of the capitalist factory, At the same time, some of the deep-seated features of the relations existing in the modern factory between the workers, the unions, and management have been brutally brought to light. In the standard strike, the following features are clearly apparent. The degree of spontaneous organization among the workers, their assertive attitude toward how production is to be organized, and management's inability to have effective control over the factory. The role of the shop stewards. The role played by the shop stewards during the standard strike makes it necessary for us to give a short explanation of this form of organization among English workers, for it has no equivalent form in France, where the shop delegates have been completely integrated into the apparatus of the trade unions. English shop stewards are in fact independent of the trade unions. They are elected by each factory department. They can be recalled by a simple meeting of the department's workers through a vote of no confidence, in which case a new steward is elected immediately. These stewards conduct most of the negotiations with management over daily conflicts concerning production, norms, rates, etc. In fact, the union's role tends to be reduced to that of formulating once a year demands on base wage rates. In England, as elsewhere, base wage rates bear little relation to the workers' actual wages, and as time passes, this relation is becoming more and more remote. The shop stewards movement appeared in England toward the end of the First World War. Between the two wars, it was the constant source of conflict in the struggle between workers and capitalists. The capitalists refused to recognize the stewards and dismissed the stewards as soon as they could, and since they were forced to meet with them often, they took advantage of the first relaxation in working-class pressure to go back on the offensive. During the Second World War, however, the capitalists were forced to realize that it would be impossible to increase production if they did not recognize the shop stewards, and England's fate depended upon such production increases. In this way, the stewards finally achieved a semi-legal status. At present, the workers would consider any attack upon the stewards as an attack upon the trade union movement and elementary democratic rights. The trade unions theoretically control the shop stewards movement, since they issue the stewards a certificate testifying to their qualifications. But in fact, there is not a single example in which a union has refused to recognize a steward elected by the workers. In France, as is well known, delegates are practically appointed by the unions, and workers are called upon only to vote for a particular union. The shop stewards' de facto independence is clearly expressed when strikes occur. As the trade unions are opposed most of the time to striking, the stewards get things moving by calling a strike as the men have been asking for. Then they make for the union and ask that the strike be, quote, recognized, end quote, which allows the workers to receive strike benefits from the large funds the unions have at their disposal. Then the union almost invariably will say that this is impossible and will ask that the steward persuade the men to go back to work. The steward will call a meeting of the men for form's sake, and then return to the union to explain that nothing can be done. Most of the time, the union will give in and recognize the strike. If it does not give in, the stewards, as a general rule, will continue their action, paying no attention to the union. But the most characteristic aspect of the shop stewards movement is that it tends to go beyond the shop level and be organized on a much vaster scale as the industry-wide and regional levels. Regular but completely unofficial meetings of shop stewards from all four corners of the country take place in most large sectors of the industry. On occasion, the stewards of all branches of industry in a given region will hold joint meetings. After many years of not knowing about this or pretending not to know about it, the bourgeois press now has been brought around to taking notice of it. One can read in the English newspapers of March 5th that on Saturday, March 3rd, an unofficial committee meeting of shop stewards in the automobile industry had taken place in Birmingham. These stewards had voted on a resolution blaming the government for being directly responsible for the crisis situation in the automobile industry, calling on the automobile workers to hold meetings and mass demonstrations on March 26th, and inviting the representatives of workers in other industries affected by the government's economic policy to join with them. They also decided to call a special conference of automobile industry shop stewards in Birmingham on April 22nd. Similarly, as soon as the problem of automation was posed on a practical level, the shop stewards, ignoring the grandiloquent and Platonic resolutions, voted for the trade unions. Similarly, as soon as the problem of automation was posed on a practical level, the shop stewards, ignoring the grandiloquent and Platonic resolutions voted by the trade unions, set up contacts on a national scale. On May 28th, the papers took note of a national conference of shop stewards in the machine, tool, and other related industries held in London on the Sunday, May 27th. This conference demanded, quote, full consultation at shop floor level before the introduction of new technical advances, increased production to be reflected in higher earnings. Employers were warned that unless they take account of these demands, they could expect all-out resistance, end quote. The unanimously adopted motion declared, quote, we are not opposed to the introduction of new technological advances, but insist that full consultation with the workers should take place at shop floor level prior to their introduction. We are determined to safeguard the workers involved and to fight for a higher standard of living as a result of automation. Full consultation, no redundancy, workers to receive full wages pending satisfactory settlement of the problems in the plant, a shorter work week, and 3 weeks annual holiday, end quote. It undoubtedly would be wrong to think that the shop stewards movement is entirely independent of the trade union bureaucracy. Some of these stewards at the same time are active trade unionists, and among those there are some who try to get the workers to accept the union's line. But the fact that they can be recalled at any moment prevents them from being able to do so systematically or on issues the workers consider important. However that may be, we need only compare the stewards' actual conduct in the great majority of cases, or the automation resolution quoted here, with the general attitude and the constant babbling of the trade unions, in order to understand that the shop stewards' movement and the trade union bureaucracy are in fact divided by a class line. Real power in the factory and the workers' self-managerial attitude. As soon as such an organizational form comes into being, despite its partial and informal character, the maneuvers of the trade union bureaucracy and the enormous weight of the means of capitalism's disposal in the factory and in society, the power of the modern proletariat appears in the fact that capitalist management no longer is the undisputed master in its, quote, own house, end quote. United around the shop stewards, the workers in many cases will refuse to carry out unconditionally the orders from the offices, bureau, in the conflicts that arise daily within the production process. A perpetually unstable and shifting compromise is achieved at every instant between the management line and the workers' collective resistance. The following two examples show that with a certain level of organization and combativeness on the workers' part and without barricades or Soviets, what is more or less in question is the very power of capitalists within the factory. In 1954, Standards Management enacted a series of regulations concerning the activities and the rights of shop stewards, which by itself shows already the degree of permanent ongoing tension that has existed in the firm. The stewards paid heed only to the parts they found to their liking. In December 1954, management dismissed 3 stewards for failing to comply with these regulations. The factory's 11,000 workers went out on strike, and after a few days, management capitulated and rehired the stewards. The second example comes from the series of actions that began at Standard this past March. At the beginning of March, before there were any disputes over automation, Standard decided to cut automobile production, which had surpassed demand, and to introduce a rotation system that involved laying off in turns 250 workers a day. Through a vote by the stewards, the workers responded by proposing an alternative method of achieving the desired reduction in production, a 36-hour work week with the same pay. Under threat of strike, a compromise with management was reached. Still more characteristic was the attitude of the workers and stewards when the problem of layoffs due to the introduction of automation in the Banner Lane tractor factory came up at the end of April. Management had announced at the outset its intention to lay off 2,500 workers temporarily, while the factory was being reorganized through automation. Later on, it raised this figure to 2,900 and announced at the same time that it would turn down any plan to reduce the workday. The firm's 11,000 workers then went on strike, and the stewards presented a plan aimed at avoiding the layoff of any workers that in fact amounted to a reorganization of the factory's production plans. They proposed 3 basic changes. First, some of the workers would be assigned to produce parts common to both the present and the new model. Some of these parts would be used as spare part stocks for the old model. The rest would serve as components that could be used later for the new model. Second, production should also resume right away at full volume on jobs already retooled and those that can quickly be retooled. Third, the rest of the displaced workers in the tractor factory should be absorbed by the automobile factory. Work in the latter factory should be organized around 3 short shifts in place of the usual combination of 1 long day shift and 1 short night shift. To management's claim that this would mean tripling the number of foremen and the rest of the non-productive personnel, the strike committee responded that the foremen could work on 2 long shifts against the men's 3 short shifts. They added that in any case, quote, it does not really matter whether the supervisors above charge hand level are there or are not, because the incentive bonus scheme stimulates the work, end quote. Beyond these specific proposals, what is important here is the workers' and stewards' self-managerial attitude. They adopt the point of view of how to organize the entire production process in the factory, and they are led to do this by the necessity so that they can respond in concrete terms to the capitalist organization of the factory and counter the damages it entails for them. The attitude of the trade unions. Since April of this year, resolutions, quote, congratulating, end quote, the workers for their resistance to layoffs, threatening the employers with strikes, etc., have followed one after another at the various annual trade union congresses and at meetings of their governing bodies. But in point of fact, the trade unions, the official leadership bodies, have done all they could to avoid having the problem placed on the terrain of real struggle of the workers against the capitalists. After a series of contradictory and evasive statements, at last their attitude was clearly expressed by Mr. J. Crawford, a member of the Trades Union Congress. Quote, when it comes to laying down union policies in regard to automation, the talks must be conducted by men at the top level, not by shop stewards. Otherwise, we will have anarchy creeping in, end quote. During the April-May strike, the trade union had succeeded through a series of delaying tactics in avoiding taking any position on the strike, but they were not able to get by so easily after it was over. When, on May 31st, Standard's management announced the permanent dismissal of 2,600 workers, the trade union secretary of the Coventry district declared that his union was, quote, greatly shocked, end quote, by the news. The same day, the factory's shop stewards decided to demand that the trade unions officially call the workers out on strike. The stewards' prudent attitude may be explained by how the situation had changed since April. Standard was in the process of reducing car production, and a portion of the laid-off workers had been working at the company's automobile factory. The strike might be long, and the workers could not hold on without the financial support of the trade unions. The union leadership was to meet on June 3rd to decide its position. This meeting Where am I? Sorry. This meeting was then postponed until June 6. When the meeting finally took place, the union leaders declared unanimously that they were against striking. Quote, instead of a strike, end quote, the Manchester Guardian innocently noted on June 7th, quote, the unions have asked the Minister of Labor to call a meeting of all concerned, end quote, to discuss the situation. The Minister of Labor, Mr. McLeod, actually received these union leaders on June 7th only to declare that, quote, whether or not there was sufficient work in a particular firm to keep on all its workers was for the firm to decide, end quote. No doubt the workers at Standard and elsewhere can appreciate the true value of this tangible outcome of, quote, top-level discussions, end quote. Automation and the capitalist economy. What is automation and what does it consist of in Standard's case? The word is vague and covers over a complex and confused reality. There's nothing revolutionary about the techniques Standard has introduced when they are taken up separately. As far as we can tell, they involve a battery of, quote, semi-automated, end quote, machines which have already been in use at Renault for years, and a certain degree of automatic control over production through electronic means. There are no absolutely new inventions as the basis of the reorganization of the Banner Lane factory. For years, research has been done on these new, quote, automatic, end quote, processes, and there have been some partial applications in a host of industrial sectors. Then suddenly it became technically impossible and economically feasible. Then suddenly it became technically possible and economically feasible totally to reorganize a factory on the basis of these processes simply by extending their application as far as possible in each individual sector, and by rethinking how they can be incorporated into one production assembly unit through methods that are themselves, quote, automated, end quote. The revolutionary aspect of, quote, automation, end quote, today consists in its ability to make a tabula rasa of the factory's previous organization and to apply en masse in every department the processes and the machines that were till then utilized only partially and sporadically. Now, the application of new processes on a hitherto unknown scale not only gives the, quote, automated, end quote, factory a qualitatively new structure, but poses on a society-wide scale tremendous problems that from the outset put the pseudo-liberal organization of Western capitalism into question. The first of these problems obviously results from the technological unemployment of workers pushed out of, quote, automated, end quote, factories. Quote, automation, end quote, appears to result in enormous savings of labor. In Standard's case, it seems that production will increase more than 40% while the personnel will be reduced on the order of 50%. This is equivalent to an increase in labor productivity of more than 180% and signifies that the past level of production now can be attained with a third of the manpower previously employed. Obviously, this does not mean that total unemployment will increase exactly in proportion to the number of workers laid off. On the one hand, unemployment ought to increase in the factories that make this new equipment. Obviously, this does not mean that total unemployment will increase exactly in proportion to the number of workers laid off. On the one hand, employment ought to increase in the factories that make this new equipment, that maintain this new equipment, and replace this new equipment at the end of its productive life, etc. And this increase in employment will have secondary repercussions in industries that produce consumer goods for these workers. On the other hand, capitalist accumulation does not immediately take the form of full investment in, quote, automated, end quote, factories. It continues for the most part to take place in the form in which investments today are made, where each $10 million invested in new equipment creates, let us say, a demand for 1,000 new workers. We cannot go here into the complex problems that are posed in this connection. The final net outcome will depend on a number of factors that involve not only the degree of labor power savings realized by new inventions, the extent of investment required, and the rate of accumulation and its distribution among traditional and new investment, but also in the long run on all the important features of the capitalist economy, just as it would be wrong to think that the unemployment resulting from automation will be exactly equivalent to the number of workers initially laid off. It would also be wrong to say that capitalist production automatically will create an equivalent number of new jobs. Even setting aside the question of the overall level of unemployment resulting from automation will be, one thing, however, is certain: unemployment awaits the workers who are directly affected. From the abstract economic point of view, there might be an equal number of workers laid off by Standard and taken in at the same time by the electronic equipment, machine tool, or even the chemical products industries. From a real point of view, however, things do not work this way at all. New jobs created elsewhere due to the existence of automation itself or to the general expansion of the capitalist economy will not be in the same locality, nor will they require the same skills. Moreover, only a small proportion of the workers who were there before will fill the jobs remaining in the, quote, automated, end quote, factory, since these jobs are now of a different nature. As the Manchester Guardian said, paraphrasing Marx, probably without knowing it, quote, what help is it for a laid-off mechanic from Coventry to know that there are jobs open for bus conductors in Edinburgh, end quote. The problems the workers will encounter are practically insurmountable. The feat involved for the individual worker to acquire a skill, find lodging, and then move in cannot easily be repeated twice in a lifetime. From the capitalist point of view, these considerations cannot be taken into account. A firm cannot base its equipment and production on the principle of keeping its present workers employed. It is in the autocratic logic of capitalist production to treat the worker as just another commodity, which ought to move about in order to meet demand and transform itself in order to answer the requirements set by economic demand. That the object of this displacement or of this transformation is the very person of the worker does not change the matter one bit. At the limit, if the worker cannot be transformed so as to conform to the exigencies of this mechanical universe, which is in a state of permanent upheaval, his fate cannot and should not be different from that of any other instrument of production that becomes outmoded before becoming completely worn down. He is simply discarded. In the past, this was the way capitalism, quote, settled, end quote, the problem of technological unemployment. But what was possible in the 19th century is no longer possible with the proletariat of today. Its actual power within society today prevents one from merely saying that the workers should just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps or else die of hunger. Present-day capitalists know that under such circumstances, the worker might raise themselves up. Its actual power within society today prevents one from merely saying that the workers should just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps or else die of hunger. Present-day capitalists know that under such circumstances the workers might raise themselves up in a completely different manner. The problems posed by the relocation of laid-off workers, lodging in another locality, new training, paying for all these things, can be faced only on the national level, and they call for state action. In Western capitalist societies, this state of affairs can only give new momentum to the efforts of state and trade union bureaucracies to intervene concretely at specific points in the organization of the economy. It is only too natural, then, that the Labor Party's daily paper, the Daily Mirror, published on May 8th a multi-column center-page, quote, 10-point plan for the second industrial revolution, end quote, starting from the principle that, quote, unless there is political planning, there will be industrial chaos, end quote. The labor newspaper demanded that the government provide funds so that laid-off workers can move to other localities, that it furnish them with the necessary housing, that it cover the training expenses of workers who have to learn new skills, that it set up, quote, expert mobile teams, end quote, to attack the problems created in various regions by the introduction of automation, etc. Much more characteristic is the great liberal daily paper, the Manchester Guardian, which not only adopts this point of view completely and insists that only the state can assure a solution to the problems created by the introduction of automation, but goes so far as to write, quote, "We might have to take a leaf here from the Soviet book, discussing yesterday how the Russians dealt with the problem of, quote, automation, end quote, by Mr. S. Babayants, a leader of the Russian engineering unions, on a visit to this country, said that the new machines meant no loss to the workers, for those replaced were trained on full pay for other jobs before a change took place." End quote. Quote, "Individual managements," end quote, the paper continues, quote, "have an obvious responsibility for such training, but clearly they cannot be expected to shoulder full responsibility for it. If we had a national scheme of this sort, there would be far less fear of, quote, redundancy," end quote. This is the kind of help that the unions should now be demanding from the government, and it is the kind of help that should be given, end quote. For the time being, the conservative government has restricted itself to launching appeals for calm and to declare that, quote, "the area of manpower is in essence an issue that ought not to be determined by the government," end quote. But this attitude can be maintained only so long as the introduction of new methods remains limited in extent. But this attitude can be maintained only so long as the introduction of new methods remains limited in extent. The inevitable expansion of automation will oblige the Tories to throw their, quote, ideology, end quote, overboard. It won't be the first time, or to stand aside. Automation and the capitalist factor. But the effects automation has on the structure of the capitalist factory, on the concrete relations of production, and on the daily activity of the workers have a still greater impact. From May 14th to 17th, a conference on automation organized by the European Productivity Agency took place in London. We present here the statements of one of the participants, Sir Serge Collomb, a technician at Renault in Paris, as they were reported by the English newspapers. They take on their full significance when it is remembered that the trade unions brought together by the EPA are anything but, quote, subversive, end quote. After having recalled that Renault had launched its own automation program in 1947, and since that year the factory's labor force has increased 15% and production 300%, Mr. Collomb continued saying, quote, "It has not been possible to attain a state of equilibrium in the redeployment of the labor force. The number of workers downgraded by automation techniques is higher than that of the new post created, and often requirements for the latter are such that the new men must be recruited from other categories." The gap between production and training is another key problem of automation. The company's apprenticeship scheme was taken unawares and was unable to foresee 3 years in advance what the works would need. A few years ago, milling machine hands, fitters, and turners were required. Now the need is for the machine setters and other different sorts of workmen. Hours worked are not reduced, and although somewhat better paid, the workers in sections which have turned over to automation have not received the advantages announced by the automation prophets. The workers' isolation in the midst of complicated machinery may have very serious repercussions and accentuate the dehumanization of the work felt all the more in the absence of hard physical labor, end quote. As for wages, Mr. Collomb said that obviously it was not possible to make use of piece rate wages or bonuses, since the machines determine the rate of work. the company had to go ahead with an extensive reevaluation of various jobs to set up a wide range of new wage scales. This astonishing declaration requires little comment. Here we have a technician in a capitalist factory. We must pay tribute to his honesty, which in a few sober lines demolishes the entire mythology of capitalist, quote, progress, end quote. We should merely emphasize the significance of the information he provides on wages. Automation moves yet another, quote, objective, end quote, basis from wage disparities. Management reacts by going ahead with the, quote, extensive reevaluation of various jobs, end quote. This is the increasingly widespread practice of initiating, quote, job audits, end quote, which obviously cannot help but be arbitrary, for they are designed for one purpose alone, maintaining divisions among the workers. In order to understand the effects automation has on the concrete structure of the capitalist factory, we must grasp the social function it is called upon to fulfill in an exploitative society and its place in the history of capital-labor relations. Considered in the abstract, the major technical changes in the field of production in capitalist society appear as the result of a relatively, quote, autonomous, end quote, technological evolution, and their employment in production appears as the result of an application of an equally autonomous, end quote, principle of profitability, i.e. independent of all social considerations. In fact, the application of these changes in mass to industry takes on an extremely precise social content. Bluntly speaking, it almost always constitutes a moment in the class struggle, a capital offensive against labor, considered as the originating force in production. At each stage in the development of capitalist society, which begins by corrupting everything and bringing everything into its service, technical changes are the sole apparently conclusive means of, quote, disciplining, end quote, the workers. This is done by attacking the workers' living productive forces. In each instance, a factory of some sort is wrung from the worker and incorporated into the machinery. In each instance, a faculty of some sort is wrung from the worker and incorporated into the machinery. Unable to tolerate the worker's ongoing resistance, capital distorts the technique when applying it in the production process and subordinates it to the pursuit of its own utopian goal, the elimination of man qua man from the sphere of production. But at every stage, this attempted elimination of the human element again and again proves impossible to achieve. The new technique cannot be applied in mass unless millions of workers adapt themselves to it. This new technique itself opens up new possibilities that cannot be exploited unless the workers collaborate in the process of applying it within the sphere of production. Sooner or later, the concrete dialectic of human action in production, of technique and of class struggle, brings to the fore the predominant element in the modern production process, the proletariat. Thus, the technological revolution that took place around the time of the First World War with the introduction of semi-automatic machinery and assembly lines appeared to capital as the initial stage in finally ridding itself of skilled workers. The capitalists thought they would be left with a mass of, quote, unskilled brutes, end quote, with whom they could do as they please. 20 years later, they had to stop singing this tune. The universal application of these new processes had culminated in the creation of a mass of semi-skilled workers, homogeneous and disciplined on its own behalf. Now that narrow occupational skills have disappeared, the creation of this well-organized mass of workers is of decisive importance for the evolution of the production process, since this mass of workers is all the more ready and capable to resolve the problem of workers' management of production. In fact, capitalism proves to be much less capable of disciplining the proletariat of 1955 than of 1905 in production as well as in society. It only succeeds in this thanks to the trade union and political bureaucracy. It is within this context that the application of the techniques of automation will acquire its true meaning. We easily could go back and show the links leading from the, quote, economic, end quote, and, quote, technical, end quote, imperatives imposed upon business firms to the historical signification of this movement tending toward increased automation. But what concerns us here is this historical meaning itself. What the application of automation objectively aims at in the present era is the replacement of every 100 semi-skilled workers with a score of, quote, unskilled brutes, end quote, and a score of, quote, salaried professionals, end quote. But what we now know about automation in its actual application at Renault, for example, shows us that put in contact with semi-automated machinery, unskilled workers and some skilled workers tend to appropriate for themselves the, quote, know-how, end quote, that is involved in applying these new methods. In particular, we know, too, that what seems to make sense for an individual firm becomes an absurdity on the larger scale of capitalism as a whole. Applied to production as a whole, this transformation would end up giving a majority of workers a greater technological education, culture, end bracket. Barring its ability to throw 60% of the population out of work, capitalism will then have to face a still more skilled, more conscious, and more intractable proletariat mass than exists at the present time.